Journalism sucks, man.
That seems harsh.
But it's real. I mean, you're feeling this, right? You're seeing this.
You know I feel it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was just, telling you over lunch, we did, I don't know what you had. You had some chicken or something. I had a sandwich, and we sat in the car and did the long-distance lunch. And I was just telling you how utterly defeated by Twitter I feel today. And that's not every day, but it's just, I'm frustrated with the state of how we know things about our world.
So I am looking at 2 websites. You're not an idiot, so you know what 2 websites I'm looking at right now. First one, I'm going to read it to you.
Okay.
GOP lawyer turns tables, scorches Democrats at impeachment hearing. Okay?
Okay.
I'm clicking over to another one. GOP lawmaker scolded after interrupted impeachment hearing. That's literally,
and they're describing the same event.
The same event.
Yep.
What the heck, man? This sucks.
And that's where I'm at with Twitter. I saw one just like that the other day. Same political topic, stupid impeachment thing. And just so it's clear to everybody, I don't care. I just don't. Maybe not, whatever. I'm indifferent. But there are 2 screens on in the same bar, and they're both showing the same witness testifying at some kind of, I guess, impeachment hearing. I'm not really following it. And it's the same guy, and the banner across the bottom, one says, so-and-so expert witness completely exonerates president. The other one says, so-and-so expert witness completely condemns president for doing X and Y and Z. It's the same guy. Both are completely live, saying the same exact words, and I'm being told it means exact opposite things. Yes, I'm frustrated with the state of journalism.
Well, let me ask you this. Why is the banner there? Like, why is there a banner there? Why isn't it just the
Because
dude?
We're idiots? I don't know. Because if the banner's there, that is a subtle signal to a certain percentage of the audience that this particular news outlet sees the world the way you do, and you should watch their ads and buy their products. I don't know. The whole thing feels totally compromised.
How do we get to truth, man? That's all I want. I just want the truth. Journalism used to be the answer, didn't it?
That's the same thing I want, man. And I don't know if it used to be the answer or not. I'm finding more and more that when I'm pretty sure something used to be good and then I go back and look, I just see that it was maybe complex and compromised in different ways. I kind of wonder if the percentage of good is always about the same for everything in terms of all of history. I don't know. I'm sure it was compromised before in ways I just haven't thought about yet. But I want to know things. I'm responsible for things. I want some of the stupid arguments where we fight about the reality of the thing to be settled so that we could just have a civil, intelligent conversation about whether there's a problem we could fix here and how we might go about doing that, so that we could talk about the philosophy of the thing as well. And it just feels like we can't even get to the part of the conversation that would actually be helpful and make people like each other and partner up to fix some things that maybe need to be fixed. It just feels like it's all about scoring points, gaining power, making money. And that makes me feel maybe more skeptical than I've ever felt in my entire life that I actually even know what's going on.
Okay, so got it. I think we all feel and understand the problem. You've been telling me for months about this guy that you know. He's your friend. His name is Mark Coddington.
Yes.
Who is he? What's the deal? What are we about to do with this guy? I don't really understand. I'm just kind of sitting here at the table because you told me this would be interesting. What are we doing?
Yeah, let me tell you about this guy. First of all, we are friends, so some of this is going to sound a little harsh, but I think I have the credibility with him to say it. He goes to a really fancy college, Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, where fancy people go, and got like some kind of degree or something. And then apparently that translated directly into being a professional journalist right out of undergrad with a pretty good gig at a significant newspaper in Nebraska. And then he's like, oh, it's not enough for me to dominate at that. I want to win the internet before anybody even knows what winning the internet is. So I'll just look up the people from Harvard, or maybe wait for them to look me up. And I'll create this news aggregation thing where even though I don't have any graduate degrees yet, I'll just bring together all the best minds about journalism in the whole world. And I'll just kind of facilitate a conversation amongst them on a website that doesn't even exist yet. And then he succeeded at that. And then Harvard was like, that's a great idea. We just want our name on it. And he was like, okay, I guess so. Whatever, Harvard. And then after that, he went and got a PhD at Texas, which I am told is pretty good for the whole journalism thing, so that he could teach and write about all of that. And then he just wrote this book called Aggregating the News, Secondhand Knowledge of the Erosion of Journalistic Authority, which seems to fit with what we're talking about. And smart people have reviewed it.
He's literally written books about journalism.
Yeah.
And like all this stuff we're sitting here talking about, how we don't like journalism, he's written books about that, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, absolutely. And he wrote encyclopedia entries in, I think it's called like the Encyclopedia of New Media or something like that, way before anybody even knew what new media was actually about. And now he's a professor at Washington and Lee in Virginia. And he teaches, all levels of undergraduate students, all of this kind of stuff, and helps them think about journalism. So he's the smartest guy on the topic I know, which I resent.
What does he teach at the university?
I don't know what all classes he has, but it's much more than like, here's how to write an article. He covers really complicated, fancy philosophical stuff. We can just ask him.
But he literally teaches journalism.
Yeah, that's his deal. Yep.
But more importantly, you guys are actual friends, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've been friends for a really long time. He's one of my favorite windshield time phone calls. He's on my very, very short list of, I got a bunch of time and I need to catch up well with this person kind of phone calls. It always gets past what we're doing with our lives and into ideas really quickly. And I always wish that you were on the horn with us, because I think it would be really fun to put you two guys in a room and talk about the areas of interest that you share. So yeah, we are friends. We do talk about a bunch of things. And I think the place I want to start when we get him on the horn here in a minute is we did this like Moneyball scheme between the two of us to try to dominate the men's beer league, like not even the A level, but the B level of the men's beer league in Grand Island, Nebraska, one time with softball. And we were surprisingly effective. We didn't have like athletes per se, but we had strategy and statistics and math, and it was super, super fun. So I'm probably going to lead off asking him about that. It's very important.
That's awesome.
We just need your trust on this.
I'm excited to meet this guy.
Well, let's go do it. Mark, this is my friend Destin. He makes stuff on the internet. Destin, this is my friend Mark. I've known him since forever and talk about smart things, and he's really, really neck deep in the world of journalism and knows a lot about how it works, and he just wrote a book about it. So thought it'd be fun to put us all in a room and talk about things that Mark is into.
It's nice to meet you, Destin.
Nice to meet you too as well, Mark. I've heard a lot about you. I hear that you're like an expert in journalism and maybe the smartest person alive when it comes to how media works. Is that what you said, Matt?
I might not have said exactly that, but I mean, I feel like I was pretty effusive in my praise.
So, Mark, you are, help me understand. Matt's told me that you created a book, or you wrote a book about media and like new media and things like that. Does that include social media, or are you more thinking about journalism and stuff like that?
All the above, I guess. I've done a decent bit of research on social media and news, and especially how journalists use social media. That's not kind of the main thing that this book is about. The book that I just finished writing was kind of built out of my doctoral dissertation, which is a sure way to get the entire audience to tune out. But I swear it's more interesting than you think. It is about news aggregation, which is basically all of the work of kind of repackaging news into ways that are sort of more palatable, of forms that are more palatable to people. If you think about like your Facebook news feed, if you use that, or, like your Apple News app or Google News or things like that, it's usually news that started somewhere else and kind of took a different form, was repackaged or reorganized or rewritten by somebody by the time it got to you. So I did a book that was basically a study of the people who do that kind of work. What is that work like? Is it like the stuff that journalists have been doing forever? Is it like reporting? Do they consider themselves journalists? In what way is this similar to what journalists have been doing and different? How is this new? How does this play out in digital media, social media, that sort of thing? So yes, it's kind of about social media and sort of about how news kind of disseminates or flows on social media, but especially about the people who make it happen, who bring the news to your social media feed or your app or wherever you get it.
Which you kind of know a little bit about because you were sort of an early adopter of the news aggregation thing yourself, right?
I was. I wrote a column every week for a website called the Nieman Journalism Lab. It's run by Harvard, and they just kind of cover where is journalism and media going. And so I just started writing it for my own website while I was still a newspaper reporter. And they ended up picking it up. And it was basically a weekly column of basically kind of summing up, here's what people said and wrote about the future of journalism and media this week. So everything was just kind of condensing and repackaging other people's ideas to try to make it, put it in a digestible form for people who just don't have time to like keep up with every little discussion and argument. And this was during the time in the early 2010s when all these newspapers were laying people off and Apple was introducing the iPad and people trying to figure out whether to pay for news. So it was just so much to digest. And I was kind of repackaging it for people to kind of consume a little bit more simply. So yeah, I was doing it myself.
And then in addition, so the professorship thing, what kind of classes do you teach and what is that about?
I teach a lot of like journalism practice stuff. I teach students how to report and write. I teach them how to make, videos for news, how to record audio for news, all of that practical nuts and bolts, just try to get our students jobs in news and public relations and things related to that. And then I also teach some stuff on media and politics. I teach a class on social media. I teach a class that is called Media Bias Beyond Right and Left, which is kind of about how political journalism works. And then I teach like research methods and all kinds of things like that. So it's sort of we're a relatively small department, so it's kind of all hands on deck. People just kind of fill in for each other. So I teach a wide range of stuff.
And you're a baseball stat nerd.
I am. In fact, one of the kind of background history that Matt and I have together is that we actually kind of strategically optimized our church rec league softball team. And we spent probably more time talking strategy about that team than we actually spent playing softball. So we successfully maneuvered ourselves to about fourth place in the league, I would say.
We were not the fourth most talented.
You're talking about church softball, right? So it's like all the sneaky guys that like cheat a lot, that kind of stuff, right?
We did not.
No. We were the bad guys, though. We didn't want to be sponsored by our church. I mean, we liked our church and everything. We were like, that's lame. Everybody goes out and gets a sponsor. We're going to make our own. So we went and bought Cobra Kai Dojo t-shirts from the internet.
Yeah, you did.
And pretended that Cobra Kai sponsored our team, and we all just paid the sponsorship fee. So we were the Cobra Kai Dojo. So we were the embodiment of evil, even though we were the church team in the league.
So you were...
But I got to translate for you guys because it's not the same, Destin. You're picturing, because I've played church league softball with you in Alabama, and that was legitimately a church league. Like the Presbyterians play the Methodists and stuff like that. And there's like 100 Baptists.
Oh yeah, definitely. We all get together and pray at the beginning, and then we go just destroy each other. Which
was mind-boggling. Like the umpire called everybody to prayer at the ball game I played with you.
Oh yeah,
that doesn't happen in the North.
It's amazing.
It was a lovely time. Everybody was really nice. No, but this was not that kind of thing. What Mark is describing is a city league softball team, where with a bunch of people from church, we entered under the moniker Cobra Kai Dojo, and all of our jerseys said "Sweep the leg" on the back.
That's awesome. I just Matt, I just texted you a picture of the Cobra Kai logo. Is that what it looks like?
That's exactly what it looked like.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. So Mark, were you on board with this idea, or was this Matt just manipulating you into making things weird in the church softball league? What was the deal?
Oh
here?
No, I was totally a co-conspirator. Matt was in charge, but I would like to call myself like an assistant manager or something of the sort. I was behind the scenes tactics. I will say we named ourselves as sort of the embodiment of evil in Cobra Kai Dojo, but we also made it our practice that after every game, we would give the other team, or at least invite them to share with us, orange slices and Capri Suns.
What?
Yep.
At the end of the game?
Yes.
Yes. We had two policies. One was we never, ever, 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 ever complain about officiating. Like, we're going to be completely cool to the officials. It doesn't matter how hard we get jobbed. Doesn't matter. And then the other policy was we will bring Capri Suns and orange slices and share them with our opponents after the game, regardless of how the game went.
That's fantastic. Did they take you up on it, or were they like, that's a little weird? Because I don't know if that would fly in Alabama.
Most of them were a little bit weirded out by it. So there was no actual alcohol allowed. So I think some of them assumed maybe we wanted to bring alcohol but weren't allowed. But no, we wanted to bring them Capri Suns. And even if the alcohol were allowed, we wanted to bring them Capri Suns and orange slices. And that was a strange idea to many of them.
I love it. That's awesome.
It was fun, though. And here's the thing, Destin. Do you watch baseball at all at this point in your life?
Right now?
Yeah.
No. Maybe the World Series.
Okay. Have you seen the defensive shifts, the defensive realignments that teams are using all the time now at the pro level?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You'll switch everybody. Like, you don't even have a third baseman at times if you've got a lefty that can only pull it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly that. We pioneered that at the church softball level to the point that it created a vigorous debate about whether there needed to be positioning rules on defense in city softball.
Oh, that's excellent. That is fantastic.
Very proud of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we would do this thing where if somebody made it to first base, we'd almost kind of welcome it. And then we would turn second base into what we called the out factory.
Yeah.
Because then as a shortstop, I could play anywhere.
You can play deep, like almost left field.
Yeah. And then we'd shift Mark up to like a shortstop that plays directly behind second base.
Yep.
And then my buddy Bill, his job was just basically be a first baseman, but cover second, even stretching into the outfield if necessary to make the out factory work. And it just infuriated people because people would hit line drive base hits to left. And I'd just be standing there. So it's really easy. It's not a base hit at all. I'm sorry I was standing there right now. But if they hit some, smoke and ground ball through the hole, well, that's going to be an out at second as well. And so the out factory was a very effective strategy. And people wanted to ban it. They were arguing that you shouldn't be allowed to do it, which is nonsense. Baseball implodes upon itself if you ban the shift.
Yeah, one thing I used to do is I would play a certain position at rover. And then I would, as soon as the ball was pitched, because you know how softball works, you've got like 3 seconds when it's in the air. As soon as the ball was pitched, if I could see the batter change his foot position, I would sprint instantly to another position and it would throw him off. Even if he had no intentions of hitting there, he had to think about me. And so I'm just trying to get in his head. And so it sounds like you guys are doing that, but like to the next level and at a industrial scale.
We tried super hard.
We were so obnoxious. we were really annoying, and it got us above 500. That was quite the accomplishment, we thought.
But what all this stuff tells me that you're a strategic thinker, Mark. You're not like just a normal guy. You're a friend of Matt's, but you're a strategic thinker in a completely different area of expertise, which is journalism and media and things of that, right?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to get Mark on here, because you, Destin, are a very strategic thinker. You're identifying Mark the right way, very strategic thinker. And so my conversations with both of you are very similar in terms of let's workshop a thing. But usually I workshop very different things in my conversations with Mark than I do with you, Destin.
Yep.
But this is a place where the Venn diagram beautifully overlaps because you and I talk social media, journalism strategy, what chess pieces are people moving around behind the scenes. We talk about that a ton. I mean, our DM thread back and forth on Twitter, dating all the way back to you yelling at me as a form of introduction, is a fascinating study in our observations in our internet travels. Mark and I talk about this stuff all the time too. So I thought, hey, what would be really fascinating would be to just put everybody in a room and talk about Mark's area of expertise and pick his brain about where journalism was and where it's going and let you bounce questions and observations off of each other and stuff. So that is my evil master plan and why we're all hanging out together. This episode of No Dumb Questions is brought to you by HelloFresh. With HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit, you can get easy seasonal recipes and pre-measured ingredients delivered right to your door. All you have to do is cook and enjoy. What do you like about it, Destin?
It's simple, man. I mean, you just open the front door. There's food sitting there. You take the box inside, you put the food in your fridge, and when it's time to cook it, you just pull out this really simple step-by-step instruction guide, and you just make it right there. And it's wonderful and delicious, and it just makes everything easier, and your family can have a meal together, and it's something that you wouldn't have cooked otherwise. It's like if you're in a rut of fried bologna and macaroni and cheese, which I'm sure you eat.
We've talked about this.
We have talked about this. It can get you into some really interesting, more novel things that you wouldn't necessarily make for yourself, like Tuscan pork sausage and pepper spaghetti or like chicken pineapple quesadillas. I mean, like good stuff. And yeah, it just totally changes up the meal thing at the house. And it does it in an easy, fun way.
What I like about it is that there's this one moment of forethought that I put into it where I'm like, oh yeah, I do the HelloFresh thing and I like this. And all I have to do is put this singular moment of thought into it. And then everything else just happens. The wheels go into motion. It shows up when it's supposed to. It comes in the temperature-controlled box. Everything is fresh, just like in the name. And then, like you said, it's doable. I can comprehend this. and food happens in a reasonable amount of time. It's not fast food, but I don't want fast food. It's 30 minutes. I learn things when I do this. And then if something changes, I can back off of it while I don't need to be getting HelloFresh because I'm traveling or whatever. Or if stuff's crazy busy and dinner is just definitely something I don't have time to go and track down in all kinds of different places.
At the grocery store, yeah.
I can go really heavy on the HelloFresh and just cover like an entire busy season in my life with a couple of clicks. So yeah, we've talked about it a ton. We're both huge fans.
Did you see what the offer code is this time? 9 meals? Is this right? Is the copy right?
Yeah, it is. It's a new promo code. I looked twice as well. So if you go to hellofresh.com/NDQ9 and use the code NDQ9, you get 9 free meals, which is a lot of food. And again, if you're entering into a busy stretch in life or a busy time of year, this would seem like a really good time to do it because pretty much you're just covered for that chunk of time.
Yeah, that's crazy, man. So you just stay at home and the food comes to you. 9 free meals with HelloFresh by going to hellofresh.com/NDQ9 and using the code NDQ9 at checkout. That is a seriously good offer.
We love HelloFresh. The people behind it, the product. If you haven't tried this thing out yet, you're missing out. It's as excellent as we're saying, and all the people who have tried it out can vouch. So thanks to HelloFresh for getting behind the podcast. Thanks to all of you for supporting the sponsors, which in turn supports us. All right, let's get back to talking about journalism, eh?
Let's do it. So can I ask a couple of dumb questions? Or maybe there are no dumb questions with you, Mark.
No, there aren't. That would be a thing.
I just want to set the boundary conditions for my brain so I understand like what you think about. First of all, super dumb question. What is journalism? Like if I wanted to go on the street and find a journalist, what would that person look like? What do they do? And who do they work for?
That's not at all a dumb question because, well, that's the name of the podcast, and because that's a question that a lot of scholars have been spent at least the last decade and a half really trying to figure out. Because it used to be pretty straightforward. The journalist was the person who was employed by a news organization as a professional and had a particular job to get news out to a public. And they probably had a fedora and a little, little thing on their hat that said press and, that sort of thing, and a flashbulb camera. But that's changed quite a bit. And the notion of the kind of closed off journalists has kind of given way to anybody could do an act of journalism. If I, as a concerned citizen, go to attend a city council meeting of my local city, there's something that I'm upset about, and I just start tweeting stuff from the meeting. Here's the stuff the council members are saying. Am I a journalist? Do I sort of transform into a journalist in that moment, in that act? And I would say certainly that's possible. Like that's something that I can do. And one thing that some folks have talked about is that we should think of journalism as acts rather than people. You can kind of put on and take off that hat depending on whether you're doing acts of journalism. And I would generally describe acts of journalism as, broadly speaking, there's some scholars who talked about it as providing, kind of the purpose of journalism being providing people with the information that they need to be free and self-governing within a democratic society. So to the extent that I'm doing that I'm providing people with the information that they need to make decisions about democracy, whether it's to vote or to kind of make democratic decisions or hold people accountable, things like that, inform their opinions, then I could be doing journalism, whether that's just tweeting through a social media account or whether I am, the editor of the New York Times. So it gets a lot more complicated, in terms of like, where do your loyalties lie? Because there are a lot of people who can provide information that can be useful to people, but they're part of political campaigns and they're not doing journalism. They're ultimately doing politics, and information is part of that. But the broad kind of idea I would give is that we start to get somewhere when we think outside of people, and we think more in terms of like journalism being a thing that people can do, whether they're professionals or not.
How would you have defined it before that answer, Destin?
Journalism?
Yeah. I mean, what was your operating definition?
Just someone who gathers stories and distributes it mostly on the behalf of a major news outlet of some sort, some form. Like, I don't think I would view myself as a journalist.
Kind of, though. Like, especially all of your social media stuff. I mean, all of the inauthentic actor stuff that we talked about here a few months ago. That was kind of journalism, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so, but it doesn't feel like official journalism. Like Brady Heron used to work for the BBC. I mean, he was in journalism. He would take a camera
with a giant flashbulb.
He would go get a story and he would report the story in this very non-partisan kind of way. Like these are the facts. These are the way the things are. You make your own decision. And for me, that's kind of where the seesaw tips one way or the other, is if you're trying to influence somebody in a certain direction or you want them to think about a thing a certain way. And of course, journalists do that. But for me personally, I think that's where I draw the line. If someone is trying to actively influence me to think about something in a certain way, they're kind of tiptoeing towards manipulation or towards information skewing, if you will. And so, I don't know, that seems to be a pretty clear line for me. Where back in the day, they would just say, I'm thinking about Walter Cronkite on the news, right? This thing happened today, and these were the statistics of the thing that happened, and this is how it went down. Back to you, Amy. You know what I mean? Right. Like, there is not a place right now where I can go consume news that just tells me the facts of what happened. Because just the fact that we're talking about a certain topic is something that I want to amplify above the signal to noise ratio that is my social media feed. So the choices of what topics to cover in itself is that's almost like a decision that you can use to influence people as well.
Well, and in that sense, aggregating is journalism, or you could make a case that it is, because whatever you cover is whatever narrative you're trying to frame. I mean, you go look at Drudge Report, which has been far less conservative than it has been in the past. But just what goes onto that incredibly simple old aggregation site, it's curated the way it's curated for a reason. He's got an angle on stuff. Does Drudge Report count as news aggregation, Mark?
Oh, absolutely. I would call it one of the kind of modern pioneers of aggregation. I'm not necessarily sure I'd call it journalism. It just depends on how expansive of a definition you want to take. There's some really smart folks, I was kind of quoting them earlier, who wrote a really good book back in the mid-2000s called The Elements of Journalism. It's sort of the Bible of modern journalism. Like, most every professional journalist by now has read, or at least, skimmed and pretended to read a copy of this book. And they talk about journalism at its core being a discipline of verification, that ultimately there has to be some real attempt to verify the things that you're saying, rather than just kind of rebroadcasting them. So I would say, as far as Destin goes, to the extent that Destin is really attempting to kind of verify the information that he is gathering and not just kind of rebroadcasting it, or that he is following sort of truth wherever it might go, as opposed to kind of having a preset narrative. I want to influence people to think about this. To the extent that he's doing that and has that verification kind of at the fore, I think he could be doing journalism more so than the Drudge Report might, if they're just passing along other people's information and just kind of slapping a, kind of funny or angry headline on it.
What's the deal with talking about me in the third person? What was that all about, Mark? What are you trying to do?
Sorry.
Well, so Destin Mike, he could be doing, am I suddenly a lab rat to you? What's going on, man? Level with me.
Right here, man.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about your definition, Destin, because everybody has an agenda. If what is and what isn't journalism is defined by having or not having an agenda.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that come up in your conversations, Mark, in terms of how much of an agenda is allowed before it's news commentary?
Yeah.
And no longer journalism?
I think that's a pretty common misconception, if I can kind of more directly push back on how you've thought about things, Destin, is that I don't think a sort of just the facts attitude is necessary for journalism for a couple of reasons. One, like you and Matt have been saying, whose facts? Who decides which facts are the ones that tell the story? Who decides when something is like nailed down enough to be the facts? Those are all judgments. Those are all subjective. Those are all decisions where, people have had to make decisions together saying, that these are the facts that people need to know. Why do they need to know this? Well, because we think this is important for this. Boom. Now we're kind of getting into opinion, and one could argue getting into advocacy. That's just in the straight, just the facts. The other reason is historical, in that kind of journalism has only existed for depending on when you start it, because it kind of evolved, like barely more than a century. For most of the United States' history, that sort of just the facts kind of journalism was unheard of. All journalism was advocating a particular view, in many cases much more strongly than we do now in the American journalistic system. Not to mention, our international listeners would say, what are you all talking about with this? Like, the only kind of journalism is just the facts sort of journalism. Because the dominant norm in much of Europe and much of the rest of the world is all journalism comes at you with an explicit point of view, and that doesn't keep it from being journalism. So I don't think that those two things should be treated as mutually exclusive.
Let me ask you this. So it's rare that I get a chance to talk to someone that's a journalism professional, like you've studied this area. When did journalism kind of bust out? We talked to Laura Arricchio, and she explained to us that, back in the French Revolution, even, these people would print out these pamphlets and things got really weird and people would try to like sway public opinion and things of that nature. Then at some point it started to solidify into, was the word journalism invented back then? What was the idea there? When did it start? And then when did it solidify into something we know as journalism today? And then clearly there was another shift away from that. And at some point it started going away from traditional journalism into something even weirder. What's the timeline of journalism briefly? How does that play out?
Yeah, so the journalism that we know as journalism today, the stuff that might be kind of recognizable, I would say a lot of the pivots took place in the 1890s, and its sort of transformation was probably more complete by the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s. So before that, as you talked about, you kind of had like pamphleteers, and really there was, we often associate journalism with reporting, like going out and finding out the facts, talking to people, interviewing people, observing events. That did not really exist as like a specific task that was in any way related to journalism until at least the mid-1800s, like Civil War era-ish. Before that, it was really just political advocacy. It was not really in any way substantively distinguishable from what we might think that like a local political party head might do. That was more or less who ran your local paper.
Yeah, it was just like somebody who had hired a press, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's like, oh, well, this is an important thing I want other people to think. I'm going to pay this person who literally presses this stuff onto paper and distribute it. So at some point, just telling people what you want, like all the weird stuff that happened in the French Revolution, at some point that went to the wayside. You said in the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s, we started to have some kind of code of ethics for journalism. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of happened really gradually over the 1800s. Like the 1800s were the really big century in journalism when so much changed. The biggest change was in, you talk about the French Revolution era, late 1700s into the early 1800s. The main source of income for journalists was political parties.
Ugh.
Yes, it's true. Like the classic era of this is Jefferson and Hamilton in the 1790s. They had their own kind of selected publishers, and the way they would fund them is they would put them on government payrolls with, kind of plum printing contracts that they had given them. And so that's how they would subsidize them. They would kind of find above board ways to pay them. They would give them, okay, we'll print all of our contracts and all of our government documents, our party's documents through you, and that's how we basically subsidize your publishing of the newspaper. And in return, we give you something, you print it. And many times they actually believed in what they were printing. They were just ruthless. They were attack dogs. And the level of vitriol in many ways would shock us today.
Give me an example. I don't believe you.
You had newspapers accusing opposing candidates of having venereal diseases.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That also existed within religious correspondence.
Yes.
What?
Yes, that.
Yep.
Yes, there's actually a great book if you want to like dig into this called "Infamous Scribblers" by Eric Burns, which is a really fun story of like right after the founding of our country, the first couple decades after that, how nasty and mudslinging it was.
William Henry Harrison as the clap.
It was nuts. So yeah, just a lot of, your mother was a whore, your father smelled of elderberries, all this kind of stuff. And I think sometimes when we talk about partisan media today, you hear people say, oh, well, it used to be partisan. Like it was more than that. It was not like Fox News. It was like literally your local paper was the local Democratic Party newsletter. It came straight out of party headquarters. It was not people who are independent, but who just happened to, be Democrats or Republicans or Whigs or whatever. They were actually part of the party apparatus. Newspapers were the party communication apparatus. And that really started to change.
Did people understand that? Like, did people realize?
Yep.
At some point back in the day, it was like, well, it's in the printed page, therefore it must be true. And then at some point, it shifted to where it was straight out of the party line. So people would filter naturally. They'd filter the news.
Yep. Well, for one thing, the news was really at that point more for kind of the upper political classes. So there were many people who were this was just operating, kind of just outside of their realm. It just did not affect their lives. This was just something that rich people argued about. But those who consumed this and cared about it, generally they seem to have subscribed to multiple newspapers because they just knew that like you were not going to get the whole truth from one of them. They would subscribe to the local Democratic paper, the local Republican paper, or the Federalist paper, or whatever it was at the time, and they would subscribe to a handful of them. And one of them they would read more favorably, and the other ones they would read less favorably. So yeah, like a lot of newspapers today, like local newspapers, you'll see the newspaper has the name the Democrat or the Republican or the Independent or something, and that was just literally telling you this is where we're coming from. This is the Democratic newspaper. So to answer your question, Destin, like no, media trust was pretty low in any given paper.
But at what point did that change? Like that changed at some point, and then the public started to expect Walter Cronkite to tell them exactly what was going to happen without any influence or anything like that. So at some point, people came to expect, like, I will get true data from these people. If someone said that Pearl Harbor was bombed like this, then that's clearly what happened. This clearly isn't a misinformation campaign against me, the public. At some point, that trust was established. So how did that happen?
So a lot of that is these changes in the latter half of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. And there are a bunch of changes. There's kind of a lot of complex things going on at the same time. But one of the big ones was that journalists' form of funding themselves, they started to wean themselves off of parties. They decided, okay, we're going to either, as a decision or just as a matter of necessity, not take that money. And instead, they funded themselves, even circulation wasn't going to cover it. They started funding themselves by advertising. So the way that you get the most advertising money is by reaching the largest number of subscribers. They started to realize if we want to reach everybody, we cannot just present the Democratic way of seeing things and only the Democratic form of news. We have to kind of advertise ourselves as being politically neutral, that this is not just the paper for people in one party, because we have to, as a matter of kind of economic survival, we have to kind of expand our reader base as broadly as we can. So we're going to make a bid to we are the news for everybody, that everybody can trust.
The market forces are what determined truth to come out in media? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
I wouldn't say truth. I mean, it sounds like the market forced people to consider a larger audience.
Right.
And then obviously I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but all of a sudden it seems like the market is forcing people back toward considering only one audience.
Right.
It's rewarding that behavior again.
Right. I mean, the market is what forced them to kind of make this bid for the public to trust them. It doesn't necessarily mean the public had to trust them. That was only one half of it. That was why they decided to kind of move in that direction and try to make that bid. Like, you can trust us. We're for everybody. We're not going to just pound you with so-and-so is a rat who impregnated some 15-year-old girl or something like this. The type of stuff they did in like the early 1800s. No. We're just going to give
some
you
of that was accurate,
stuff.
By the way.
None of it, for the record. And the other side of it, what sort of led them to actually build the public's trust was the stuff that you were mentioning earlier, Destin, which was codes of ethics. And you started to have journalists kind of decide and kind of build up this ethos as a profession. Like, we're professionals. We have kind of a code of conduct. We have a particular ways that are appropriate for us to act and are not. More and more of them like went to college in actual professional education programs. You had journalism schools who were born in 1906-ish. In the early 1900s, you had this kind of professionalized way of training journalists because they looked at all the other professions like, say, doctors, lawyers, accountants, clergy, etc. And they said, okay, these are the ways that they have sort of built up the public's trust and had the public believe the things that they tell them and say, yeah, you've got exclusive kind of reign over this area of society. So like, we're just going to try to copy them. We're going to try to do the same stuff. And it took several decades, but it started to take, and the public started to buy that. And that's really gets you into like, 1920s, 1930s up to pre-World War II, where the economics had forced journalists to kind of, and news organizations to make that bid for the public's trust. And then they started to try to back it up by saying, okay, we're going to act like a profession. These are what professions do. And we're going to kind of copy the more well-respected professions in the types of things that we do. And eventually that's going to lead for the public to trust us. And more or less that worked for at least a period of time.
So is there an equivalent oath that journalists take similar to the Hippocratic Oath?
There is not.
The Hippocratic Oath is the, like,
we
do
should
no harm.
write one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I got a pen.
Well, I mean, the Hippocratic Oath is the oath that doctors take to say, hey, these are the ethics that we're gonna follow in our profession. First, do no harm, blah, blah, blah. But there's nothing like that in journalism.
There are codes of ethics. Like, the most prominent one is the Society for Professional Journalists, SPJ. They have a code of ethics. You can Google it right now. They got it on their website. But like, nobody is required to affirm that in order to, like, there's no journalism license in America. We could start talking about various European countries where you actually do have to do that. But in the United States, especially because of the First Amendment, we have this strong, kind of attachment to the idea of freedom of speech. That, like, what are you going to?
As well, we should.
Yes, I'm not being critical of that. What are you going to do if somebody doesn't affirm it? You're just not going to let them write stuff in the newspaper? Like, no, there's no way that's constitutional. There are codes of ethics.
There's no way that's moral.
No way that's moral. Sure. There are codes of ethics, but there's no way of enforcing it. And that's a way in which, when you have a doctor, that they have been licensed, they have affirmed the Hippocratic Oath. So there's a higher level of trust there because they can enforce that sort of ethical adherence, whereas journalists, for good reasons, can't. But it also is going to have repercussions for the level of trust.
So is journalism getting better, or is it worsifying?
Mostly worse. I would say like 65% worse, 35% better.
Before you answer that, can you just describe what was happening with your buffer bar right there? Can you take me behind the scenes as you decided how to answer that question?
Well, it's just, journalism is just not one thing. It's so many different things. It's not like a coherent. People talk about the media as if it's like some, like cigar smoke filled room of like people who are all making decisions together. It's just stuff going on all over the place. And there are some areas of it that are totally getting better, and really a lot of interesting stuff is happening. And there are other areas that are just awful and getting worse, So it's like if I asked you, Matt, would you say that like religion is getting better or worse? And you'd be like, geez, which
worse.
Religions, Okay, you can answer it a lot more
No, I didn't
easily.
say that. I just said worse.
Okay.
But I think the reason the religion's getting worse is because your discipline's getting worse. And I think the places where religion is least touched by your discipline, or at least the ugly parts of it. It seems to be, I think all of these things are informing each other is my point.
Okay.
I think this is really, like, a lot of the things that ail us right now are about a breakdown in knowledge and communication and listening. And part of what's fun about gaming this stuff out with you all the time is that you got a really good perch to observe how the communication and listening side is going. And where it's good, I feel like things in turn get better and the conversation gets better. Where it's icky, motivated by weird financial factors or political ambitions masquerading as journalism, or the design is just to create division and conflict, because with division and conflict comes opportunity to accomplish things you can't when people are kind of happy and cool with stuff. It seems to produce gross results regardless of what discipline you're talking about. I'm guessing that there's gross information sharing in the world of the hard sciences as well that doesn't move things in a good direction.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I would agree with some of that. I don't think that, like, journalists are causing religion around the world to go down the tubes or anything like that, which I know is not what you're saying anyway. But
but I think journalists are taking cues from how angry religious people talk to each other. And I think religious people are taking cues for how quote unquote journalists talk to each other.
Yeah, I could see
and
that.
There's just this general acceptance of combativeness resurging, whereas that kind of calm, steady objectivity where it's hard to get mad at somebody, you don't see as much of that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's part of what I'm thinking of when I say that journalism is on the whole getting worse. I think the number one way, when you ask journalism scholars, and especially when you ask journalists about ways in which journalism is getting worse, the number one way that we often tend to answer that is not the same as, like, the general public that tends to answer is, like, local news is getting hollowed out. It is in trouble. There are just
What do you mean?
Newspapers. Newspapers are dying all over the country. And this is, kind of in the U.S. context, it's worse than most right now. But you're basically having a lot of those local newspapers have been cut to the bone. Like the Denver Post. I mean, I don't know if you know
That's the
story
example
of the
I was
Denver
just going to
Post.
bring up.
Yeah.
I sure do.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, Denver, Colorado used to have two newspapers, as you know, the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post. The Rocky Mountain News closed in 2009. And between those, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, so I'm just, ballparking it. Between those two newspapers, they had maybe 500-600 people covering Denver and the state of Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region. It's a massive region. And they had 500 people or so. This is like, say, in the 90s. This is just...
Their sports department alone had Woody Page and Adam Schefter.
Right. I mean, their sports...
Just in the Denver Post.
I would not be surprised. In fact, I think it's a pretty safe bet that the sports departments of the two newspapers were larger than the entire news gathering operation of any newspaper, which is just now the Denver Post in Denver today. So the Rocky Mountain News closed in 2009. The Denver Post newsroom size, where it was now, used to be between the two newspapers, again, I don't know, I'm guessing 500, 600, is now in the dozens. We're at like 40 or 50 people, something like that, full-time people, to cover the entire city of Denver and Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region. We're talking millions of people. And at all those, public organizations, people using the taxpayers' money, issues going on, culture, local governments all over that area. And you've got a few dozen people at the main news organization who are responsible for watching that, And
But what's your understanding of how that happened?
That's so to go back to the kind of advertising subsidy that we talked about, we shifted from political parties to advertisers. Really, newspapers have never really gotten all their money from circulations. That would never cover the operation, whatever you pay to subscribe. The vast majority of their money came through advertisements. And there were a number of things that just completely ate away at their advertising business. One, of course, famously was classifieds. Like Craigslist just did exactly what the newspaper classifieds did, only for free. And that was that for newspaper classifieds. And the other big one was that newspapers' value was really in this kind of bundle of a whole bunch of different interests. If you think of a family subscribing to the newspaper, like Matt or Destin, did your family subscribe to newspapers growing up?
Yeah, they did, actually.
So you subscribed to a newspaper in, wherever, small town Alabama, and
right.
chances are different people in your family liked different things in the paper. Somebody was interested in political news, but like you sure weren't. And somebody else was interested in sports news and maybe the prep football scores. And somebody else was interested in the display ads, to figure out what deals were there.
And the funnies, dude.
And the
comics. That was YouTube and memes and email forwards before those existed.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
So the value was, like, you probably wouldn't have subscribed to the newspaper if it was just one of those things. It had to be all of those things. And the value proposition only made sense if all those things were together. Well, the problem was the internet came along and you could split all those things off. You could do the funnies better in all the ways that Matt just talked about. You could do sports better in, just sports scores and analysis, that you wanted.
Sports is a very visual thing.
Right.
You can see them.
Yeah, so you could do all these things. Every single thing that the newspaper did that people actually cared about, you could basically do better online. The one thing that they couldn't really be done better online, that wasn't done better online, was the local news reporting. What is the school board deciding? That never really got duplicated, but it turns out that's not really why people subscribe to the newspaper anyway. It was all those other things that kind of subsidized the hardcore kind of meat and
But Mark, just
report.
to jump in for a second.
Yeah.
All of what you're describing too, if you look at that as a collective whole, like I remember I had a paper route, Fort Collins, Coloradoan. I would drag myself out of bed. I could probably still do that paper route from memory. It's the neighborhood Adam still lives in, so I know the rhythm well. I remember which houses were subscribed. I remember the houses that had people who were jerks and would yell at me if the paper wasn't like standing on end, leaned 1 inch from their front door frame. It's all very vivid to me. But as a result, we didn't have a lot of money at that point in our lives as a family, but I got a subscription to the paper for my family. It was something I provided as a kid by doing this paper route every morning. And I would come home after I got done with my paper route, and I would just distribute out the paper kind of around the kitchen table, and everybody would do just that. They'd grab what they wanted, and I wanted sports. I was deeply troubled that the Fort Collins Coloradoan did not cover WWF wrestling. And then finally they talked about like WrestleMania 2 or something like that in one article, and I remember just being blown away. And so I'd read the sports, I would check George Brett's numbers in the box scores and see how the Royals did. And then I would take the funnies and I would go into the bathroom just because there was room. And I wasn't like do anything in there. There weren't bidets back in those days. So, I didn't actually use toilets until bidets came out. And that was a really liberating experience. But I would just put the lid down and I would sit in there with my breakfast and the door open because it was my own little kind of quiet space in my family house. And I would read the funnies. And then when I was done with those, I would bring them back out. And Dad would always have something from the front page news that he'd be reading about. And he was making a really intentional effort to help me understand the world. And he'd be like, well, something important happened yesterday, son. And then he would explain it and we would talk about it. And I would show Dad something funny in the comics because I knew he'd never read it otherwise. And then we'd have a shared joke. And then every now and then somebody we knew would be in there locally, or we'd like get in the picture of the parade. And so we'd clip that out and get 100 different copies. That local newspaper thing, what it did is it caused our family to all encounter aspects of the news and the world that we wouldn't otherwise because we got it for one part of the package deal. We just couldn't help but handle other parts of it as it passed through our hands or as it was seen lying around. And so I felt like our awareness as a family of what was going on in the world was greatly increased by having that newspaper, because even if we tried to avoid parts of the paper, we couldn't help but just osmotically gather some of that information and be a little bit more aware of things. And I don't think the internet does that.
Yeah, absolutely. What you are talking about is something scholars have often called it incidental news exposure, like news exposure that happens when you're not
there's a
looking
word
for it. And that's one of those things that news organizations have, newspapers have been like really good at. And TV is another one too, even though I think TV is not really as rich of a source of like news as newspapers. You just think of a family who's just watching The Simpsons. I think of when I was a kid, just watching The Simpsons, and then we just kind of leave the TV on because, I don't know, we're just hanging out and, doing whatever in the living room, and then the local news comes on. And then your ears perk up because of something you hear on the local news. And that sort of thing happened. I will say that happens on social media. Certainly news creeps into people's feeds, especially on Facebook and Twitter, a little bit less so on Instagram.
Yeah, but you can hijack it. You can fake it. If you get a few people riled up who aren't journalists and haven't done any homework, you can make a conversation happen that doesn't really make any sense, isn't really newsworthy, but somebody's got something they want to grind.
Yeah.
So it's more hijackable than the newspaper or the TV.
Absolutely. It used to be that there were not actually that many people who had control over the news that we consumed. I mean, if your news sources were the Fort Collins Coloradoan versus whatever Denver TV stations, you watched, there's not that many people who actually have the decision-making power to determine what goes in front of your eyeballs in terms of news every day. We had to have a lot of trust in those people to wield that power real well. And many times they did, and other times they really didn't. And now, like you're saying, anybody could, in theory, have that power to basically say, not necessarily anybody, like somebody with 20 followers on Twitter is probably not going to get the job done. But there's so many more people who have that power to kind of take your attention. And not all of those people, a lot of those people are not acting with good intentions. So that power has really been democratized.
I don't think they need to necessarily care about reputation as much, but I bet you remember the names of some of those newscasters who came on after The Simpsons on Fox when you were a kid, right?
Yeah, some of them. Absolutely.
Destin, do you remember any of the people who gave you news when you were a kid by name?
By name?
Yeah.
One of them's name was Kim. I forget her last name, but I can see her face, and I can see her sitting in front of the desk and reading the pages in her hand. But I remember thinking, oh, she says it's probably true.
Yeah, I can trust her.
Or, I remember thinking that stuff was written for her, but, there was a sense of authority that came. Kimberly Essex, that was her name.
Dang, nice pull.
Do you think, Destin, she deserved that authority?
Well, it's interesting because back in the day, part of what people were trying to do is just look authoritative, or whatever the word is. Yeah, I just Googled her name. She's still over at the local TV station. Yeah, I think she deserves that authority in terms of the way she handles things, but it's clear that she's just reading what other people are writing. So I don't know. It's something about the pomp and circumstance of a local TV station, and at least the assumption that there's some type of rigor that goes into it that made me trust it, if I'm honest with myself. But now that I think about it, I don't know if there's a lot of rigor that went into the news that Kimberly Essex would read me.
Do you remember the names of the 3 major news anchors from the national news when you were a kid?
I know several news anchors, but I don't know the 3 big ones. I mean, you got Katie Couric, right? But she was more of a interviewer. I remember Walter Cronkite from back in the day. And that's probably it. What about you? Do you remember the names?
Oh, absolutely. Burned in my memory. We would bounce between all 3 channels. We didn't have a remote, so I had to get up and change the channel between the news stations.
You were the remote.
It was Dan. I was the remote.
Oh, Dan
Rather.
Yep.
It was Tom Brokaw, and it was Peter Jennings. Those were the 3 when I was a kid, and we were watching the news like that.
I remember those.
Yeah, and I trusted them.
Mark, you had a follow-up to that, clearly. Should I not have trusted these people?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Like, I think one of the things that a lot of media scholars have argued is that a lot of the forms of news kind of traditionally that you grew up with, taking television news for specifically as an example, have been partly about manufacturing news, getting that news out as a product, and partly have been about sort of manufacturing that sense of authority. Like, there's a lot that goes into the visual presentation of TV news that is kind of entirely tangential to the process of actually communicating the news. That's more about sort of manufacturing that sense of trust in you. And TV news has developed a language that really connotes that and really has you feeling, I trust that. And a lot of what their effort goes into is simply just communicating that trust alongside and sometimes even over and above that information. So I think sometimes when I think about some of the news stories that I wrote, if I were to have like published alongside that, like a detailed blow by blow of like how this story was put together, your level of trust in that story would have dropped dramatically. Because like it feels trustworthy because it's in that newspaper and it's got the writing style that you expect. But like I just talked to one person and it was like a 7-minute interview and I already knew what they were going to say. And like I took notes and I'm, like 94% sure that I got this down accurately. But I don't know, there's a little thing in the back of my brain that's like, maybe I got this wrong. And turns out after I published it, the person was mad or something like that. You don't ever get to see that because news organizations traditionally have been really good at and really dedicated to hiding that because their goal is to just get you to feel that sense of kind of blind trust, at least historically.
I've actually had experience with that. I was in New York one time and I was asked to go to New York to be a part of this thing that was happening with this company. We won't talk about what it was or who it was, but part of it was we're going to be in this room and we're going to do this activity together. And we're doing it so that we can make a press announcement or a press release. I was invited to participate because of some stuff I did. I was like, okay, yeah, I'll go. And so I went. And when it came time to I flew to New York. I walk in this room. There's other people that are doing the same sort of thing. And a couple of news outlets walk in the room. One of them was like a guy with a camera. Another one was just a lady with a pen and paper. And I was like, oh, that looks like a traditional journalist. We had this 30-minute long thing we were going to do. And they got there and they had already written the story when they walked in the room. We started our thing and it was going to take however long it was going to take. They were gone in 5 minutes because they had already written their story and all they needed were photos to go with the story that they had already written. They didn't even stay for the entire event where the announcement of certain numbers and statistics and things that were important. They didn't even stay for that. They were like, we got our story. We know what we want to say about this. We need some photos. Cool. Look happy with that. And got it. We're out. And so we were left doing the rest of this press release with nobody in the room but us. And I was like, that's jacked up. What just happened?
And embarrassing.
Yeah. And I was like, this is crazy. I was like, is that how that goes down? I was adding up the money. Like I was in the room and they had flown me up there. That was like probably flights and hotel. That was $600-700. And then there was a couple other people in the room. I was like, they spent $3,000 or whatever to get all of us up here to do this. And then the journalists already knew what they wanted to say. I was a little angry, to be honest, because I was like, they don't care about, the truth. They just had their angle on it. And they wanted to write about that angle. That was my takeaway. You think there's any truth to the way I felt about that?
Absolutely. I think that happens all the time, And the thing is, if you had been a person with no knowledge of that situation, whoever their intended audience was, consuming that news story, probably how would you have perceived that news story? You wouldn't have known without knowing anything of what went on behind it. You'd be like, oh, that was pretty much a straightforward, just the facts kind of story.
Right.
Thanks for giving it to me straight. And like, they weren't giving it to you straight at all. They decided before they even showed up what that story was. And you just kind of filled in a couple blanks for them, So when we talk about, to kind of bring this back, when we talk about sort of, advocacy sort of journalism or that sort of thing, like I think it's really a myth that journalism was at any point just kind of going out, finding the facts, and then just like laying them all out for you without any sort of like angle or judgment applied. That's just always been part of the sausage being made. Journalists have just been really good at obscuring it. And you only get a glimpse, a peek behind the curtain when you're on the other side of it, like you were, Destin.
So let me ask you this, Mark. You kind of laid out this story arc of modern journalism to me. You said back in the day, the press was literally owned or subsidized by political parties or whoever. And then at some point, the market forces dictated that we needed to be more even-keeled and just tell the facts so that we could appeal to more people. And then after that, at some point, as the internet started doing these things better, they started doing the sports better, they started doing the classifieds better. At some point, the internet started doing it better than the newspapers until it didn't. And that's when we're in this ambiguous gray zone right now where things are kind of mishmash and we can't really tell if we're trying to do the old style journalism where there was integrity and they were just giving me the facts straight, or we're doing the really, really old style stuff where it's clearly meant to persuade. So the question I have for you is journalism dead? Like, has journalism as I knew it when I grew up, is it dead?
That one I can give a pretty unequivocal answer to, and that's no. Like, there's good journalism happening all the time. We've been kind of waxing nostalgic for like our childhood news consumption patterns. But when I think about what kind of like quality information was available to me as a child growing up in like rural Wisconsin, I had the Wisconsin State Journal out of Madison, I had the local TV, and then I had the network news. And that was like more or less it for like straightforwardly reported stuff I felt I could trust, or my parents felt they could trust. And now, I mean, on any given day, I am reading stuff from news organizations all over the world, from magazines, newspapers, not so much from TV. The range of information that is available to you via the internet, it's not as if there's just nobody out there doing that kind of quality work. It's just that that's not the type of stuff we're really inclined to seek out.
What you're saying is, oh, well, there's still people that are truthful and they tell good things. Got it. I'm with you. I understand that.
Yeah,
but the question is journalism dead? Meaning, yeah, of course, I can pick up the phone and call you and ask you what's happening in Colorado and I can get a straight answer. But what I grew up with was the ability to pick up a newspaper and be rightfully informed every single day. And I'm asking you if that's dead, and you're saying no. But at the same time, you just wrote a book about journalism. And so I would submit that you might be inclined to tell me that journalism is all right and healthy. And so I don't know if I can get a straight answer out of you. I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek here. Does that make sense?
Controversy.
Right.
Yeah. How do I know I'm getting a straight answer out of you, Mark?
I don't really have any way of challenge or of being able to assure it. You know, that's really what it comes down to. Neither do journalists. We're trusting each other all the time for that kind of stuff. And again, I have the signals for you. I have the signals of authority in that I can say I am a professor at, such and such a university, and I have earned a PhD, and I have Matt vouching for me, whatever that's worth.
That actually is a lot more. The fact
that you intoned it.
The fact that you guys gamed your softball team actually goes way further than any of your fancy letters on your name, if I'm completely honest right now. The fact that you Cobra Kai'd other people, that means a lot to me, honestly.
So authority is formed in very, very strange ways. It's in the eye of the beholder. Yes, I do have an interest in saying that that journalism is not dead, because my livelihood is based on teaching people to enter this field. So yeah, you can take that for what it's worth. I think the very fact that there are, as we've said, really interesting quality work and investigations going on all around the world is proof that it's not dead.
No, what you're saying is, no, you can trust me. I mean, I guess. But then I think the obvious counter to that in this jaded time in which we live is that sounds like exactly what someone you can't trust would say. I mean, how do you cut through all of this stuff is ultimately the question. And as I'm listening to you chew through a ton of really interesting stuff, some things that stand out to me about at least why Destin's question is valid, why it's worth wondering if journalism is dead or what the future of it's going to look like. You got first of all, a signal to noise ratio problem that I'm hearing you describe. That being that at one point that authority was kind of consolidated into a small group of people, not very democratic. That's problematic in a lot of ways. And so what do you do when something's problematic? You react the other direction and you completely democratize information. And then what we quickly figure out is that a lot of people are full of crap and want to weaponize this sense of authority that still comes from print or video. And that is wearing off, by the way. Mm-hmm. But we're still in that place where there's enough of this vestigial authority that's automatically attributed to black and white print, or they have a website.
Right.
But I mean, the number of podcasts on planet Earth doubled in the last year. So saying I have a podcast really means I bought a microphone and a $5 a month Libsyn subscription. And people are going to figure that out and understand that there's really no demonstration of authority. It's just you saved up a couple $100 and you did a thing. Saying I have a blog, that used to be whoa, you figured out how to put things on the internet. Now everybody knows how to put things on the internet. Saying, I made a video. Well, now everybody knows how to make a video. those authority by proxy just by merit of the medium, I think that stuff's going to go away in the next 5 or 10 years. And I think that will actually help us to better sort through what is legit journalism and what is complete garbage. And it'll help us to figure out which model we really want to embrace as consumers of information. Do we want to embrace the spam model that is, I have no regard for my reputation, I have no regard for repeat business or earning trust. All I need is for people to buy into this idea once, and I have won, and then I'll disappear and reappear in some other way on the internet later. I mean, all the calls that you get for warranties on your cars and open enrollment for healthcare, they got to send that stuff out to 10 million people. If they get 5 who are dumb enough to sign up, I mean, that's a good day. There's no credibility being earned versus the journalism model moving forward. Maybe instead we'll pick anyone who spams is lying automatically. Just, nope, even if I like what they're saying, anyone who is presenting this in a spammy way is lying. Only people who have taken the time to nurture a reputation and a track record of trustworthiness are to be trusted. And I really do think that might just filter out in the next 5 years. I got 2 more things I want to bounce off you, but let me just pause there. Does any of that ring true to you, or are you less optimistic than me?
I couldn't have said it better myself. You have really crystallized it quite a bit. That basically, one of the themes that we've been kind of circling around this entire conversation is that the decision of gauging authority and credibility was sort of artificially easy for us for a long time. Like we've been talking about how implicitly we just trusted Walter Cronkite or Kim on Alabama television, and like maybe we shouldn't have. And now that kind of automatic authority that's just vested in you by virtue of publishing news in a certain way has really eroded. And some of that is for the better, some of it's for the worse, that people are kind of now unduly skeptical of news where they really don't need to be quite as skeptical as they are. But I think it forces people to take a more active role in actually considering what is actually credible out there. And for a lot of people who just live busy lives, that's too much work. That's a lot of work, and a lot of people are just throwing up their hands and saying, forget it. I don't know who to trust.
That's why, for me, the most valuable asset I have in my life right now is my reputation.
My bidet. Reputation.
Yeah, well, not the bidet, but they're just my reputation. I've carefully crafted over many years the appearance, because it's true, that Destin is not going to lie to you for sake of some quick internet bucks. Or like, I'm not going to take the easy way out and say the thing that you want me to say in order to get clicks. I'm going to take the time and do this series on misinformation, even though I know it's going to probably not perform super well, but it's important. And I want to do it that way. I'm the kind of person that studies that stuff. I want to get truth.
And let me just jump in for a second. You do all of that almost to the point of being irritating at times.
What do you mean?
Because I send you crap on Twitter and I just want you to be mad. Would you please just be irrationally angry with me? We're not going to put it on the internet. We're not going to go tell anybody. It's a private conversation. Could we just be irrationally angry about how stupid this is? And you're always like, well, I don't know. The source, I need to verify that. Stop being responsible. No one is looking. Just melt down verbally with me for a few minutes. It's cathartic. But I'm not kidding, dude. I'm not kidding. You won't do it. And that has been very convicting to me. And the other thing, and I have a dozen things I'd like to criticize you about soon, so don't get carried away here.
Sure.
But the other thing that I would say you do well, that I've seen that most wouldn't, is I've seen you pass on a lot of money. I've seen you pass on opportunities to have people pay you to say things you don't think. And I've never seen you say things you don't think in exchange for money.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's important.
So nice job.
Thank you for saying that. No one's ever said that or acknowledged that. And it's certainly a thing that happens in my head. Is that something? So Mark, you teach journalists, you teach these students how to do all this stuff. Do you teach them things like that? Like how to earn trust with people? Like Matt's talking about, it really is almost like playing a long game where you have to invest in your own personal reputation so that, 5 years from now, when you're reporting on something that's really weird, people will trust you. Do you teach your students to do that?
I try. I think oftentimes the nuts and bolts of teaching, the level that I'm teaching at is earning some sort of authority through basic competence. That's like where I'm trying to get them. I mean, that really is the first level. Like, can you just communicate things in a way that people can understand? So to be quite frank, like that's the level that I'm teaching students more often, is just like, how do you take, it's really hard to write a coherent news story on a lot of subjects. And just how do you take the absolute deluge of information that you end up gathering while you report it and present it in a way that is coherent and seems like trustworthy and actually deserves to be trustworthy and actually tells an interesting story that's not going to have people clicking away after the first paragraph. So yeah, I absolutely try to do that.
So as we're chipping away at this, you're right. We've circled around a whole bunch of stuff. And that's just the fun of having, I guess, a conversation instead of an interview, because this is the kind of stuff that you and I talk about. This sounds a lot like you and me on the phone for an hour and a half drive on my way to Casper, just minus 2 or 3 dropped calls because of Wyoming. Just big picture, though, this is what I'm seeing. So we've talked about the how question. Like, how does journalism move forward? And the question seems to be a debate between spammy, disreputable, maybe it's true sometimes when it serves you, maybe it's not, disappear, reappear on the internet, versus long game, using Destin's language here, trustworthiness, credibility, make hard decisions to earn trust, even if it hurts you in the short term. So I think we're going to have those 2 how options in front of us. But I think you also very, in good detail, brought up the question of the what pays question. Because ultimately, people have to get paid to do this. It is a profession. It does require actual training. And to get good people to do it, there needs to be some kind of financial incentive. They need to be able to pay their bills. And so, Mark, and Destin, tell me if I'm wrong here. I want to review the different pay models that we've talked about for journalism. One would be the direct subscriber model. This would be newspaper subscriptions back in the day. Patreon would maybe be an equivalent now, where it's just a direct, I want you to give me a product. I want it straight from you without a middleman. Here, I'm paying you for it. Model number 2 would be advertisement. So we find like-minded advertisers who provide value to people who are smart, and we, as content creators or journalists of the past, try to also provide value. And it's sort of a partnership between all 3 groups, and everybody understands the dance that's going on. So direct pay, kind of a tangent version where the advertisers pay. Then obviously you've got state-run media, which is where the government taxes people, then uses those tax dollars to communicate information that may be true, may be good. But also, I mean, it's certainly of benefit to the person who's paying the bills, that being the state. And then you brought up an interesting one that I might not have put on my list, and that would be partisan-funded media, which is journalism that's just an entirely bought and paid for take from one particular perspective to unapologetically frame details and selectively present details to get people to sign up for a thing. Those are the 4 funding models that I think have come up in our discussion. Am I forgetting any?
There are a few others. So I would say, broadly speaking, there's kind of another area of funding model that is just being subsidized by something that's like not the actual journalism itself, some other area of the company or something like that. There are news organizations that there's a couple other ones, like news organizations that have gotten really big into like hosting events and things like that. And people will pay for their events, and that will go a long ways towards paying for their actual news product. A lot of times that's like nonprofit news organizations, things like that. Another big one is people getting, doing journalism that's getting funded by like foundations, donations, things like that. That's a model that's been around for a long time and is growing, especially in place of the collapse of the advertising-driven model.
But even that's bought and paid for, right?
What do you mean bought and paid for?
Well, if you have a foundation that's like, let's pick one I like, the Free State Project in New Hampshire, or, something that's kind of, freedom, liberty, civil liberties, individual rights kind of motivated. I mean, such an organization is still beholden to its funding source, even if it's a nonprofit, and that sounds noble on its surface. Like such an institution is not going to go out and do a whole bunch of pro-communism pieces that talk about how great Mao and Stalin were and how there's some exciting young people in the local area who are trying to resurrect some of Stalin's best ideas. Like, that's not going to run, even if it's a valid point of view. It's not going to run in the kind of foundation-funded magazine or journal that I'm describing right there.
Right.
It's still beholden to the funding, right?
It's true, although I think most of the foundation-funded journalism that's like that is not as sort of, kind of partisan or have kind of ulterior motives like you're talking about one way or another. Like there a lot of the news organizations that are funded this way, the foundation's purpose is literally fund more local journalism because local newspapers are dying. So their goal is just go out and do what the local newspaper used to do. Although not everything, just the keeping local governments accountable, reporting on city council, school board, etc. And so yes, they are beholden to that organization. But that organization hasn't really dictated a particular sort of political perspective. They're just saying, we just think this thing is really civically important and go out and report local news. But yeah, I think that is certainly an issue that's kind of at the fore with that type of journalism.
So what I'm saying is, it seems to me that in the next few years, consumers of information are going to have to pick, first of all, what kind of journalism they want, spam or reputable. And then I think we're going to have to also pick what kind of funding we want behind our journalism. What model seems to produce the best results? And what does best mean even? Is best advances my agenda, or is best most accurate reflection of truth? So question for you, which of those models do you think has the brightest future and gives us the best chance at getting the facts straight?
That is really the $1 million question. I don't think it's any one of those models. I think ultimately most all of those are going to have a place, although I except the party funded. I wouldn't even call that really journalism. That's just party propaganda. So I think all of them are going to have to play a role. I think ultimately probably the biggest piece of the pie is going to have to be made up of directly subsidized journalism. In other words, sorry, I'm using the word subsidy and subsidize a lot, but in other words, people actually paying for the product of journalism. You can only get so far by reading news that somebody else is paying for. Ultimately,
so sorry to interrupt you, but the New York Times and the Washington Post keep telling me that I need to pay for the articles online. You're telling me that's good?
Yes, they need to. They have to have paying subscribers. They are really out in front of the industry on this. The New York Times kind of went to this model almost a decade ago, and a lot of people in the industry thought they were crazy because they were actually asking for people to pay for news online when they could just get it for free from Google or wherever else. And the New York Times basically saw ahead and they just said, advertising's not going to cut it. We're just not getting enough from advertising, whether in the paper or online. Ultimately, we're going to have to ask people to pay for the product. And all of the news industry in some form or another has, outside of television, has basically followed them in that. They've realized that we got to ask people to pay for the product directly. So I would say if you really like and appreciate and think that the news that some organization is producing, if you think it's valuable and you want it to survive, you got to pay for it. With some exceptions, television is a big exception. That's still ad supported overwhelmingly. Unless it's on cable, then it's your cable fees, supported. So yeah, I do think that's a good thing.
So if people don't understand the value of quality journalism, aren't they always going to just pick the free version?
Yep, absolutely.
Well, that seems very bleak in terms of how this plays out.
Yep. I think for that reason, you're going to have a lot of smaller news organizations that are they're not going to make it. The stuff that they offer is just not valuable enough to pay for enough people. So the New York Times will be fine. They have more people paying for their product than they have had at any point in the newspaper's history. They'll be okay. But your newspaper in whatever, Huntsville, Alabama, or Greeley, Colorado, or something like that, they might find, especially as they've cut to the bone, that a lot of people, it's just not really worth paying for, Well,
yeah, if it's not good, you don't do it out of charity.
No. So yeah, which is why it can't be the sole solution. I think there's room for those other models, but it also means on the news consumer side, it doesn't happen by magic. Chances are whatever news organization you really like is struggling. A lot of them are.
Mark, do you have any news that you pay for?
I do. I pay for the New York Times. I feel bad, but that might be the only thing I pay for. I pay for a sports and email newsletter, a guy who writes about baseball named Joe Sheehan. He writes really good baseball analysis, and it's just one guy operation. And his email, basically, he has enough subscribers to cover his whole salary. And so I pay for him, and I pay for the New York Times. That's all I can think of off the top of my head.
Do you subscribe to The Athletic?
I do not.
That's kind of the same model. I mean, it's a pretty bold move with what they're going for there as well, I think. Yeah.
So everybody else can just fail, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's why.
What do you do?
Yeah, that's why
I'm joking, Mark.
No,
I don't pay for any news, and you're making me feel guilty.
No,
but I just did that to make myself feel better.
I think it's true. Like I think it's a good reminder that like I can talk a good game about this, but like 20% of my own budget isn't going toward it. My wife and I have talked about. We live in a small town that has a weekly newspaper, and we've talked for like a year that like we need to subscribe to the local newspaper. Every time we get our hands on it, we're like, oh yeah, there's interesting information in here. We just have never gotten around to like making the phone call and getting the subscription. But sometime in the next couple of months, we'll finally get around to subscribing to the local newspaper.
Hey, we want to say thanks to everyone that supports this podcast on Patreon.
Agreed.
Mainly because you decided what we do is worth your time and your money, and it's not. We're not worth it.
This is the worst patron spot ever. What are you doing? The idea is that you get more people to sign up because it's helpful.
I don't know, man. We're not worth this. Are we worth this?
Come on. You know we're not. Let's just be honest about stuff, man.
Yeah, but still, I mean, we do it because we enjoy it, but we also do it because people feel like it's worth it and it brings value to people's lives. And I want to say thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It's a big deal.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. And there's the obvious way that it motivates, which is, hey, this helps pay the bills for our families. There's the less obvious way that it motivates, which is there are people who really appreciate this. And, well, it makes me want to make sure we get it done and keep the conversation going. So, yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, along the lines of this episode, I mean, what Mark's talking about is journalism. The whole pay model and the structure, it's difficult because it depends on ads at times and sometimes it doesn't. And just the fact that you donate straight up on Patreon really frees us up to make some really interesting decisions business-wise. And we appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, and I think I don't know, if this is too much, you can tell me not to say it or we can delete it. But I think it's okay to let people know that the only other competing offer we have for funding this program is from the government of Algeria. And I don't think that's how we want to fund it. But if need be, we could become a propaganda mouthpiece for the government of Algeria.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I guess pick. Do you want that? Or do you want more of the kind of programming you've come to cherish with Destin and I doing the thing we do?
Good point, Matt. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, in the interest of full disclosure.
We can delete that if you don't feel comfortable with disclosing.
Yeah, I don't know.
That.
Maybe we should delete that later. I don't know.
I'm huge in Algeria. We never told anybody how to support.
It doesn't matter. It's patreon.com/no dumb questions, no dumb cues.
We don't know.
We're bad at this.
Just go onto the internet and start supporting things. One of them will probably eventually be us.
Yeah. All right, back to the podcast.
It's patreon.com/no dumb questions. But yes, I had to look it up.
Okay, back to the podcast.
So all of this really comes back to this, my friends. It's how do you know what's real and how important is it that you know what's real? And it seems like from this conversation and just from what I know about the past, that maybe in the past the stakes were lower in terms of knowing what's real and not. I mean, your world was smaller. You weren't spread out thinking about grand global aspirations. And then really it's kind of World War I and World War II that get us thinking that way, which means this is a pretty recent phenomenon. But it's actually kind of important in sort of a democratic Western world that you have some awareness of what goes on because your votes have the power of money and even violence behind them. I mean, the stakes are high. And this really has been kind of a bleak conversation in terms of our outlook on really our ability to know stuff. So it's kind of an epistemology question. How do you know things about what's going on right now when you can only be in one place at a time? But in our system, you're kind of morally responsible for what's going on everywhere. I mean, this information is hugely important, and it seems like it's in kind of the worst shape of my lifetime. How do we fix it?
I would say the advice is different for different people. I think for some people, the advice is that they need to be more skeptical of information, especially information that is not challenging their view of the world. I think other people are sort of overly skeptical right now with the fake news idea, and that they're completely distrusting news that really has no real reason to be completely distrusted other than it doesn't agree with the things that they believe and doesn't support those things. So I think some people, you need to be more skeptical of your skepticism of the news, kind of doubt your doubts about it.
Okay, so we're talking about like how can an individual help themselves with their problems. So we're not on to like the big picture yet.
Not the big picture.
Still small picture.
Yes.
Be more skeptical. What else can a person do to make this better for themselves?
I mean, one big thing is to like actually, it sounds really simple, but like pay attention and care. I hear a lot of people complain about the state of news today and how it's all garbage. And to me, it feels like somebody who just kind of goes around talking about how much food sucks and food is awful and I hate all the food. And then you ask them, well, what do you eat? And they're like, well, I live with my mom and I just kind of wander past the fridge, and every few hours I just kind of grab something out of there, maybe some pickles.
My mom has good food at her house. I don't know about this example.
Like,
has no cheese whiz.
But like, like food doesn't suck. Your diet sucks, and I think
that's fair. Okay.
I think that's a lot of times what I would say to a lot of people with news who are like despairing about journalism. Well, how much of the journalism that you're consuming or that you have in your mind is cable news, either consumed directly or through outraged pieces about cable news or outraged tweets about cable news? Well, like cut cable news out of your news diet, like the news world would be a lot better off if cable news was a lot less prominent, Ultimately,
I agree.
So that's like just practically starting to like, if this is something that matters to you, change your habits and start, maybe it is a little bit of eating your vegetables, but like consume news that you believe you want to see more of in the world, and like stop consuming information that you really wish there was less of in the world, because your eyeballs, your dollars sends a real signal to news organizations of what to produce more of or less of. So on an individual level, and that gets us right into the big picture too, is that like we live in a capitalist society. Things are going to follow the dollar, and dollars are going to follow people's attention. And it's a lot of it goes to what we attend to. We spend a lot of time talking about how we want just the facts. We want straight news, but like the traffic numbers say that is a lie. We don't want that. We want our views reinforced, So we kind of have to acknowledge our complicity in the system in driving this system that we say we hate.
Yeah. And that observation just really struck me, because my prescription on this for a long time has been, well, obviously I'm going to consume the stuff from the people who see it the same way I do. I'm going to be on reason.com as a libertarian, of course. But to balance it out, I should also go look at some outraged status stuff and some outraged, strongly conservative stuff. What you're suggesting is don't go look up outraged anything stuff. If you say you want just the facts, find content that gives you just the facts and appreciate the work that went into nailing down those facts. Am I reading you?
Absolutely. And I would say it doesn't even have to be just the facts. Like there's a place for opinions and ideas and advocacy. Just seek out people. My strategy is basically find people who either I know in real life or I kind of see, online through Twitter or whatever, who I like the way they think and I like the way their mind works and whether they agree with me or not. And then like find out what stuff they're reading. Kind of read over their shoulders or watch over their shoulders.
I do that to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
This whole podcast audience read How to Think by Alan Jacobs because you told me I should read it, and I respect the way you think.
Huh. I didn't know you suggested that. That's cool.
Yep.
Yeah, and Alan Jacobs, the author of that book, is one of those people for me. Like, he's become, a lot quieter on social media, but he's one of those people. I've read enough of his writing over time that I like the way he thinks. And if he points to a piece on social media and says, this is really interesting, or on his, in his writings and says, this is really interesting, this is worth responding to, I'm going to make some time for it. I've decided who are the kind of fellow travelers that I really kind of appreciate. And I've also decided who I just really don't have time for. And so just, whether those people agree with you on everything or not, and it's better if they don't. Not just, like you said, balancing it out with shouting voice from my side versus shouting voice on the other side. Great, I've done my job. I'm a balanced news consumer and a good citizen of a democracy. No, that's terrible. That's just compounding a bad thing. It's about finding the best ways that various ideas are represented and the best ways that various facts are represented. Sometimes that means you may read a news article that you think is biased, but guess what? It leaves you more informed about the situation. You're smart enough to see the bias. You're also smart enough to learn from it anyway. So I think that's really how it ends up playing out in everyday life.
So let me ask you this. What journalism should I pay for then? What should I look for in these people and then put my money behind it? And how much money should I give them?
You should give them, whatever you find in your heart, however the spirit leads, Destin, is what you should give. Like, don't put on limits on what
dark.
What God might lead you. No, no, I would say you should devote yourself to paying for information that makes you smarter about the world and makes you glad you spent time with it. That stimulates thought for you, that you find reliable, that you find is done with care, that sort of thing. It's not rocket science. It's not super complicated stuff. What stuff you come away with. And sometimes it's just a matter of keeping track mentally of I always come away with from articles from that organization saying I actually kind of understand that issue a lot better now. That really explained it well. Okay, well, if that happens over and over, you'd like to keep that around.
It's easy to feel good about things that affirm what I already know, or already think I know.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it sounds like you're describing, well, you should engage with media that is part of your echo chamber. I know you're not saying that because you're a smart man, but how do I know what a good journalist looks like? And how can I smell that out from a person who is trying to manipulate me in a very subtle way and I'm not intelligent enough to figure it out? And also, It sounded like a joke. It wasn't a joke. How much should I give that person? How much is that journalism worth?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, a lot of the stuff I named, you can easily dupe yourself into feeling with manipulative journalism. So that's a good point. I would say if you're looking for solid, good, solid sort of journalism of verification, you want to look for, do they show their work? Can you figure out where they got their information? How they know the stuff that they know? Do their sources seem reputable? Are they, just kind of taking stuff from, as I wrote about, other news organizations? Well, go follow that other news organization. Maybe that's the one that's actually worth getting your information from. Do they provide depth and completeness? There are a lot of times where, they've talked to a source, and that source seems authoritative, but, that's only part of the story. And you get to the end, and you kind of feel there's got to be another reason for this. The people on the other side of this story are not stupid or crazy. Where are they? And if you come to the end of that, that's probably not the type of organization that's worth contributing to.
Investing in, yeah.
And as far as the amount of money, a lot of news organizations don't ask for a ton. We're talking a lot of times $5-10 a month, or something like that, or even less than that. If you have means to give more, especially to maybe a nonprofit organization that even takes charitable donations, great. But as an entry point, just tossing a few bucks a month, I think is really well worth it. Again, if it's the type of organization that doesn't just reinforce your views, but actually when they challenge you, they do it thoughtfully and they do it in a way that you just say, okay, that's really well attested. It's well sourced. They show their work and I can tell how they got that information. It's making me smarter. I think that's the type of stuff to really hang on to.
The one that I support, and this is weird because when I was doing the college teaching thing, I just would never believe that 10 years later me would say this, but every time Wikipedia asks, I kick in. And part of the reason for that is it was kind of goofy, quirky, often wrong back in the day. And increasingly, I feel like they've got pretty good leadership over there. And I mean, they killed my Wikipedia page, which is a testament to how good a job they're doing, because the world did not need the information that was there. And so I find their information to be steadily reliable. I'm not an expert at anything, but, you know, I put a lot of time into the Bible, first century history, philosophy, stuff like that. And what I see in very simple form on Wikipedia usually squares pretty closely with the scholarly consensus. It acknowledges multiple positions. Usually, there are exceptions. And so I've come to really appreciate that. I understand that's not necessarily journalism, but really doesn't all of this come back to the larger question of how do we know anything at all? Yep. And how much more important is that now that we live in a moment in history where we bear some social responsibility for what ideas we think, what we believe is true. See the flat earth debate as an example of how you bear social responsibility for what ideas you choose to believe or not believe. Well, if you feel like you can't get accurate information for anybody, you're a lot more susceptible to believing things that might be completely nuts. And then on top of that, because we vote in most Western societies, you have actual tangible moral ownership over the decisions that your country is making at times. So just the basic, something that sounds as simple as just having your facts straight is really not that simple. But I appreciate you throwing out a bunch of stuff that I can do to have a better shot at knowing what the heck is actually going on.
Yeah, and I think Wikipedia, I think that's totally a legit place to put your money. I rely on Wikipedia so much, and I think if we're taking a broad view of journalism, which is, as you said, information that people need to make informed decisions and have informed opinions about society, democracy, politics, culture, history, etc., Wikipedia is a huge part of that for our society and for me personally. So yeah, giving to Wikipedia is totally a part of that.
It's the only thing I can do to virtue signal that I'm doing something here, because I support a bunch of people on Patreon that make content, but honestly, those are people more like me who really aren't really doing journalism. I mean, I go to a church and interview somebody. It's not really journalism. It's me just kind of learning for myself and sharing with people. But yeah, maybe I need to do the Patreon support of those creators that are doing more than just straight up go find things that are true and report it reliably back to me so that I can know. There's huge value in that. So big picture on all of this, thank you for indulging us on really detailed questions that I'm sure you cover with your students on like the first week of class, but to us is kind of new information and stuff that we want to know. But thanks also for going big picture, because I really do think we kind of got into the place where what we talk about here and what we talk about as friends, Destin and I, really overlaps with what you're doing professionally, and just trying to figure out what I think is an epistemological question of just how the heck do you know stuff? How can you be sure of it? What role does journalism play? And what can you do to in any way feel in control of what seems like something that's just sort of happening to you? And so, yeah, you've given me stuff to think about, and I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, and thanks for accepting the pushback I gave you there, Mark, about is journalism dying? I understand this is your field and it's super important. And I think if it does die, some of that blood's kind of on my hands. This is what you're telling me. And I think it's time for me to step up and invest a little bit in good journalism. So I appreciate you explaining that to me.
Sure thing.
If we think truth is important, we might just have to pay for it.
Yeah. And I'm optimistic. I don't think it's dying, and I don't think it's going to die. It's just going to take different forms. It's going to look different. Might be more or less strong. So I think those are totally legit questions. And I think, honestly, Matt had an awesome answer to that. So he took care of everything.
Thanks so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it, dude.
Sure. Thanks for having me on.
Here's what I do next time that you hang around, because like right now I feel like we've deprived everyone of the other half of the fun things we get to talk about, which would be sports nerdery that is really far more about mathematics and statistics than it is about like sports ball and things like that. I feel we've deprived everyone of talking about your taste in music and movies, because you have great recommendations. So at some point, I want to talk to you again in a way that I can share with people. And I don't want to talk about any of this. I just want to talk about the cool things that you've curated and shared with me over time. So sorry to everyone that you didn't get that, but you're going to get it some other time.
I would love to. I will be ready and waiting with all my recommendations.
And Destin will leave nail marks in the concrete as I drag him into yet another conversation about movies and music.
Mark's trying to go. I'll let you go, Mark. Later, buddy.
That's how our conversations always end. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.